Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
You know that feeling, right? When you walk onto a golf course and the greens are just perfect.
Lush, vibrant, firm underfoot, the whole package.
Exactly. But it's not magic, is it? It's serious work.
Not at all. It's turf management, often a real battle, like you said, against unpredictable weather, difficult soil conditions, things like that.
Right. So today we're kind of taking a shortcut into that world. We're focusing specifically on a pretty cutting-edge product, one that's designed to help make those perfect conditions, well, a bit more achievable. We've got a really interesting stack of sources for this deep dive.
We do.
2 detailed scientific evaluations of a product called Sparc Surfactant. These were trials in Ireland. Plus, we've got a real-world testimonial from a golf course superintendent over in Virginia.
Right. Boots on the ground.
Exactly. So our mission here is to pull out the most important bits about how this Sparc product performs and maybe what it could mean for you, for keeping turf in top shape.
And what's really fascinating, I think, is how these different sources, the rigorous science trials on one hand, and then the superintendent's direct experience on the other, they really paint a complete picture. We're going to explore the science, obviously, soil moisture, turf health, even that surface firmness you mentioned, and then connect it all back to, well, the practical side, applications, and maybe most importantly, potential cost savings.
Okay, let's unpack this then.
Yeah.
Before we dive into the actual data, what exactly is a surfactant in this context? Why is it so important for turf, especially on, say, a golf course?
Right. So surfactants, or sometimes people call them wetting agents, think of them as helping water work better in the soil.
Okay.
They're basically designed to improve how water penetrates the soil surface and then how it's held there, making sure moisture gets distributed evenly, efficiently, right down to the roots.
Makes sense.
And that's just vital for healthy turf, especially, in sandy root zones like you often find on greens.
Yeah.
Or definitely during dry spells, it stops water just pooling on top or running straight off.
Huh. Got it. Okay, so our first source then. This takes us to the Royal Dublin Golf Club in Ireland. An evaluation of Sparc conducted there August to October 2024.
That's right.
And it was on a Fescopoa annua sward, which, for people maybe not deep into turf, that's a pretty standard high-quality grass mix for greens, right? Needs careful management.
Exactly. Fescue and Poa annua. And this was, as you said, a preliminary look, relatively short study. But here's something really important to know right off the bat, a key factor.
Okay.
2 other commercial surfactants, let's just call them A and B for now, they had already had 4 applications put down in a previous trial before Sparc was even introduced.
Oh, so they had a head start.
A significant head start. Yeah, that pre-application history, you really have to keep that in mind when looking at these results.
Definitely not.
Now, all the treatments were applied the same way, standard knapsack sprayers, calibrated for 800 liters per hectare, but, and this is the kicker, the rates were totally different.
How different?
Well, surfactants A and B went on at 10 liters per hectare, a pretty standard, maybe even high rate for some products.
Okay.
Sparc, though, was applied at much, much lower rates, just 500 milliliters per hectare, or 1 liter per hectare, tiny compared to the others.
Wow. Okay. That is a huge difference. So keeping that context, the head start for A and B, the much lower rate for Sparc, what did this 2024 trial actually show for soil moisture? The volumetric water content, or VWC percent.
Right, the VWC. Well, the report says there were no statistically significant differences in the mean VWC overall.
The average.
The average, yeah. But that doesn't really tell the whole story. Generally, all the plots treated with any surfactant had higher moisture than the controls, the untreated areas. The means were like 10.8% to 13% for surfactants versus about 9.9% for the control.
So a bit higher overall, but you said there's more to it.
Absolutely. Because when you look at the weekly assessments, things get pretty dynamic initially, just as you'd expect with that head start.
A and B were higher.
Exactly. Surfactants A and B showed greater moisture retention early on. Like on August 24th, surfactant B was way up at nearly 19%. A was over 16%.
And Sparc?
Sparc was a bit lower than around 15% and 14% for its 2 rates, compared to the control at about 13.4%. So initially behind.
Okay, but here's where it gets interesting, right? You mentioned a change.
This is the really interesting part. Despite that initial lead for A and B, Sparc, at both its low rates, actually caught up and surpassed surfactant B and the controls in moisture retention. That started around September 1st.
Surpassed them, even
Yeah.
with the lower rate.
Yes, and it maintained that lead right through to the final measurement in mid-October.
That's quite a turnaround. What does that suggest?
Well, it strongly suggests Sparc has real staying power. It's not just a quick wetting effect that fades. It seems capable of sustaining soil moisture effectively over a longer period.
Which is what you want.
Absolutely. That sustained performance is key. And then you have to bring the application rate back into it.
Right, the 500 milliliter or 1L versus 10L.
Precisely. Using so much less product, maybe a fifth or even a tenth, to achieve what looks like comparable or even slightly better sustained moisture retention. Well, that points directly to Sparc being potentially very cost-effective. You're looking at significant savings on input costs.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense from a budget perspective. Now, beyond the moisture hidden in the soil, what about what you actually see? Turf health, quality, measured by NDVI.
NDVI, yeah. Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. It's a measure of plant health, basically. And visual quality ratings, too, just looking at how good the turf appears.
Did Sparc come out on top there, too?
Again, the report says no major statistical differences overall between the treatments, but like with moisture, all the surfactant plots ended up looking better than the controls.
Okay.
Interestingly, the control plots actually had slightly better ratings right at the very start, but the quality in the Sparc-treated plots improved pretty quickly. By the end of August, they were consistently surpassing the controls, and Sparc actually hit the highest quality ratings through early September.
So it helped the visual quality over time.
It did. There was a slight dip later by early October, but it stayed competitive. Surfactants A and B also improved, especially from late August onwards, and they actually finished with the highest scores right at the end on October 14th. That suggests their long-term effect, maybe from those earlier applications, was also strong.
So different patterns, but generally positive for the surfactants compared to doing nothing.
Exactly. All offered benefits over the control. Sparc showed good improvement and performance, especially considering its low rate.
All right. And the final piece for this trial, surface firmness. Critical for golf, right? You don't want greens that are too soft or too hard.
Absolutely crucial for playability. They used a Spectrum True Firm meter for this. Lower readings mean a firmer surface.
And the results.
Here, the data showed no significant differences in firmness among any of the treatments during this particular trial.
So no effect.
Not necessarily no effect. It just means that within this time frame and under these conditions, they couldn't statistically distinguish between the treatments or the control in terms of firmness.
Okay.
It really just highlights that firmness might be something that changes more slowly, or perhaps other factors were more dominant during this short period. It suggests you'd need a longer trial to really see how different surfactants impact firmness over time.
Right. So the takeaway from this 2024 Royal Dublin trial is encouraging potential for Sparc, especially that sustained moisture at low rates,
Yeah.
but also variability between products and a clear need for more research.
Precisely. It showed promise, highlighted the cost-effectiveness angle, but definitely underlined the need for a more comprehensive trial, ideally starting before the main stress period of summer and comparing Sparc against a wider range of leading surfactants.
Which leads us perfectly into our next source, an interim report from July 2025. This is from an ongoing trial, this time at Bray Golf Club, also in Ireland.
That's right, building directly on those 2024 findings.
And this one expands the comparison quite a bit, doesn't it? Sparc versus 6 other commercial surfactants, plus a control.
Yeah, a much broader comparison, this time on a POA annua greensward. So, slightly different grass focus, mainly POA.
Now, you mentioned this is an interim report.
Mm.
What's the big caveat we need to keep front of mind here?
Very important caveat. It is interim. The full treatment program actually got delayed. They had trouble getting hold of some of the other surfactants, so it didn't start properly until June 2nd.
Oh, okay.
And crucially, the statistical analysis hasn't been done yet. So we're looking at raw data, trends, not statistically confirmed results at this stage.
Got it. Early days, trends only.
Yeah.
But what are those early trends showing?
Well, the report sounds pretty optimistic. It notes that Sparc appears to be trending slightly better than the others so far. And significantly, it mentions they don't expect the final outcomes to change dramatically from what they're seeing now.
Okay, interesting. So even without the final stats, what did the moisture data, the VWC, indicate in this broader 2025 trial?
Well, first off, all the surfactants, Sparc included, consistently kept the root zone moisture levels higher than the untreated control areas.
Consistent with the 2024 findings?
Yes. There was just one exception, one assessment date on June 17th, which came right after some really heavy rain, so everything was saturated anyway.
Makes sense.
But if you look at the average VWC across the 4 assessments they'd done by the time of this report, Sparc-treated plots actually showed the highest average moisture.
Highest overall.
Highest overall average, yeah, at 19.65%. It was closely followed by a couple of others, Surfactant F at 19.56% and Surfactant A at 19.15%.
So tight at the top.
Very tight, but all performed well above the control, which was down at 16.64%. So again, Sparc is right there at the top, showing effectiveness across different weather conditions. They mention hot, dry periods, as well as rainy ones in this time frame.
Okay, promising on moisture again. What about turf health and quality in 2025? NDVI and the visual ratings.
Very similar story, really. For NDVI, a measure of health where one is best, almost all the surfactant plots scored higher than the controls.
Almost all.
Yeah, one exception, Surfactant E, matched the control. But Sparc, along with Surfactant A, recorded the highest mean NDVI readings. Both came in at 0.78 compared to the control at 0.74.
So top tier for health and visual quality, that's the 110 scale.
Yep, 110, 10 is best. Here, Sparc, Surfactant A again, and also Surfactant C achieved the highest average rating of 7.75.
Okay.
That compares to the untreated controls rating of 7.25. Again, the report notes no really noticeable differences among most of the top surfactants. They were all clustered between 7.5 and 7.75.
So Sparc is consistently in that top group for looks and health.
Exactly. Holding its own or slightly leading, even in a much bigger field of competitors.
Now, what about firmness? The 2024 trial didn't show much difference. Did this longer, broader 2025 trial reveal anything more?
It did, actually. Even without the final steps, the firmness assessment did show some variation between the surfactants this time. Remember, lower values mean firmer surfaces.
Right.
Sparc produced a firm surface reading 0.113. That's quite good. Definitely what you'd want.
Better than the control.
Oh, yes. Much better. The untreated control was the softest, way up at 0.184.
Okay. Was Sparc the firmest overall?
Not quite the absolute firmest in this interim data. Surfactant E was slightly firmer at 0.091, and Surfactant B was also a bit firmer at 0.1/4. But Sparc was right there, providing good firmness. It really reinforces that idea that different products can have slightly different impacts. Maybe you optimize for moisture, maybe firmness, maybe cost. It depends on the specific goals.
That makes sense. So the 2025 interim results, bearing in mind they are interim, they seem to back up the 2024 findings, would you say?
I would, yeah. Sparc is showing up consistently strong on moisture retention and turf quality, and demonstrating good performance on firmness, too, especially compared to doing nothing. It looks like a solid performer across the board based on these trends.
Okay, so we have these 2 trials from Ireland showing promising, consistent results in controlled settings.
Yeah.
Now let's bridge that gap. Let's talk real-world application.
Right, the practical side.
Our final source is a testimonial from Stephen Hansen. He's the superintendent at Boat Tour Golf Club in Trouttville, Virginia. And he was apparently one of the first courses to try what he calls this revolutionary new nanoscale wet agent Aquaritin Sparc.
And this is where it gets really valuable, I think. Context is everything. Hansen describes dealing with, and I quote, a crazy amount of rain this week, close to an inch in a short period of time.
Wow, okay, that's a test.
Definitely. And then later, after his first application of Sparc, he gets several inches of rain, followed by a major storm that just poured for 30 minutes. And this resulted in standing water on his greens.
Standing water, not good.
Especially not good because he specifies these are old push-up greens.
What does that mean exactly? Why is that significant?
Old push-up greens are basically built by pushing soil up to create the green shape. They often lack the engineered drainage layers of modern USGA spec greens, so they tend to compact easily and hold water right at the surface. They're notoriously difficult to manage, especially during heavy rain.
So a real superintendent's nightmare scenario.
Exactly, the perfect, or maybe imperfect, stress test for a wetting agent that's supposed to help water move through the profile.
Okay, so faced with standing water on these difficult greens after a storm, what did Hansen report about Sparc?
This is where it gets really compelling. He reported great results just from his first application. He noted the moisture seems to be moving down quite consistently, and importantly, he said the product worked very fast, for sure.
Fast how?
Well, crucially, on those challenging old push-up greens that had standing water, he saw it perk down in about 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Standing water, gone.
That's what he reported. Imagine the relief seeing that. And then after his second application, put on at 11 ounces per acre, which is a fairly typical rate, he said, even with less rainfall following that. His moisture numbers were looking good and consistent.
That sounds like a pretty strong endorsement from someone dealing with it day to day.
It really does. It grounds the trial data in practical reality. Seeing it work under those extreme conditions on those specific types of greens, that's powerful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But real-world performance is one thing. Superintendents always have budgets to think about. Did Hansen mention the cost?
He did. And this might be just as impactful as the performance comments for many turf managers listening.
Yeah.
He states it pretty plainly. Sparc definitely beats my current wedding agent on costs.
Yeah.
He broke it down. His old agent cost him about $350 for a 2.5-gallon jug,
Right.
which, when he calculated it out, came to $4.38 per 1,000 square feet per application.
$4.38, okay. And Sparc.
Sparc, he says, was just 69. That's 69 cents per 1,000 square feet.
Wait, 69 cents compared to over $4.
That's the comparison he gives. From $4.38 down to 69 per 1,000 square feet.
That's not just a difference, that's potentially game-changing for a golf course budget.
It's a massive difference, absolutely huge. If that holds true more broadly, it changes the whole economic equation for wedding agents.
So let me get this straight. The trials suggest Sparc performs consistently well, maybe even leads, on moisture and quality at a much lower application rate. And the superintendent confirms good performance under stress and reports this enormous cost saving. That's quite a combined value proposition.
It really is. You're potentially getting strong, sustained performance, especially with water movement and drainage, plus consistency, and at a fraction of the cost of at least some other options.
It makes you wonder, are there any potential downsides? Long-term effects, maybe, that aren't captured yet, although the trials seem positive so far.
That's always a fair question with newer technologies. And the scientific reports themselves rightly call for longer-term studies to confirm everything, especially things like firmness over multiple seasons.
Yeah.
But based on the consistent trends we're seeing in these trials, the moisture, the quality, the good drainage performance, highlighted by Hansen and coupled with that kind of cost efficiency, any potential trade-offs seem minimal, at least based on this evidence. The immediate practical benefits, like avoiding waterlogged greens, seem pretty significant regardless.
Okay, so if we try and connect all these dots now, the preliminary trial, the interim results from the bigger trial, and this real-world testimonial, what's the main takeaway here? What's the big picture on Sparc?
I think the big picture, pulling it all together, is that these sources consistently point to Sparc's ability to help maintain really consistent soil moisture levels. And that's just fundamental. It's critical for improving overall turf conditions. It also shows up well for improving turf quality, the visual aspect. And Hansen's experience really highlights a potential benefit in drainage and water movement, especially under stress.
So it's tackling several key challenges at once.
Exactly. It seems to address moisture management, turf health, and potentially drainage, all seemingly very efficiently.
Yeah, that consistent performance across different settings, controlled trials, real-world stress, combined with those significantly lower application rates and the reported cost effectiveness. It really does paint a compelling picture, not just for turf managers, but really for anyone interested in how we keep these green spaces healthy and resilient.
It's a strong combination. And look, while the scientists, quite correctly, emphasize needing more time and data for absolute statistical certainty on every single parameter, like long-term firmness.
Right, the scientific caution.
Exactly. But the trends that are visible, plus that very persuasive anecdotal evidence from Hansen, it's undeniably positive. Sparc really does present itself as a potentially very effective and, crucially, cost-effective tool for achieving optimal turf health and performance.
So as we wrap up this deep dive then, here's something to think about. We live in a world where, let's face it, environmental conditions are getting more unpredictable. Resources, like water, need careful management. Budgets are always tight. So how might innovations like Sparc, things that promise performance with potentially much greater efficiency, how might they reshape things? Not just the look, the aesthetics of our parks and golf courses, but maybe their fundamental sustainability and the actual economics of keeping them green and healthy.
That's a big question.
It is. It's a thought that goes, I think, well beyond just the golf course, doesn't it?
It really does. Efficiency, sustainability, economics, they're all linked. Definitely food for thought.